And I gave him a lot of credit for this. It wasn't an easy time. There was a lot of fear. It was a rough place. And Muhammad would always turn up the volume on his radio as we spoke, but he still talked to me, and I always appreciated that. And he wasn't somebody I just met in the street either. This is a sculptor who was pretty well known in the country. His monuments, dot the landscape. They're still there, in fact. He tried to capture, what Iraqis like to boast as the 11,000 years of history, that succession of Sumerian and Babylonian, Assyrian and Islamic civilizations. And we drove past them that day, Ishtar, Kahramana. We even saw, what was one of my favorites was Shahrazad, who was standing vigil over once libertine Abu Nawas Street along the Tigris River. And I always remember that statue in the street itself was kind of, it was a mix of what I thought made Baghdad great. Its medieval glory was represented by the statue, that fabled Baghdad of the Abbasid Empire, of an unabashed self-confidence. And then there was Abu Nawas, which in its modern heyday a generation ago was a freewheeling stretch of riverside parks and restaurants and bars. And I remember as we sat there talking that day, as Muhammad and I were driving down that street, he knew that those worlds, both of those worlds, were forever gone. He looked out at the trash, along with uprooted trees, discarded bricks, and rolls of concertina wire, to catch the glint of the sun, and it was snaring garbage. The scene was like Baghdad, I think, out of flux and permanently in disorder, just as it is today. It was the first time that he had seen this statue of Shahrazad, since he had come back. And I'll never forget him breathing this sigh of relief. There was still something left in his city. The Baghdad we were looking at was a lonely landscape. It was getting ready for horrors that I don't think we could then even imagine. The street, its secular, liberal, even cosmopolitan milieu, was recent history, but not everything was lost. That statue was still there. "Look how beautiful she is," he said to me. "No one comes anymore, but Shahrazad remains." And as he left, he went up to a young boy who was selling soft drinks out of a styrofoam cooler. "Take care of the statue," he told the boy. "If thieves come here, go tell someone. Don't let them take her away." I think so much has happened since then. Like I said, I'm going to try to sketch a little bit of a different notion of what's happened over the past 8 years. I think so much has happened since those conversations I had back in Baghdad with the bookseller and the sculptor. Both in Iraq and across the region, that's wrestling with its own traumas. I think traumas that are propelled and often initiated by American policy that, from abroad at least, feels singularly imperial. I've often wondered what it might have been, or what it might have felt like to be in Berlin as World War II drew to a close, or in Baghdad as the Mongols approached in 1258. I wonder if the dread I so often feel in the Middle East is anything akin to that. I wrote a book about Iraq. I called it Night Draws Near, and it wasn't just a title to me. It was a feeling, in a way, of what's ahead, of what my sense of the region. A year after I had met this sculptor, I moved to Lebanon, where I tried to cover the Middle East. And I think for much of my life, growing up, living and working in Lebanon had been my goal. Here was this elusive promise, I hoped, of what the Middle East would represent, a cosmopolitanism that embraces diversity, and an intellectual space that celebrated criticism and critique. And I have to say, the Lebanon I arrived in a couple of years after Baghdad was still brutalized by its civil war. It was blinded by that conflict's lack of resolution. And I think as in Iraq and Egypt and much of the Arab world, the cosmopolitanism of the bookseller and the sculptor were gone. And instead it was nostalgia. Nostalgia is often simply, I think, an appreciation of loss, no more. And I think a lot of people who have spent time in the region understand the power of that nostalgia. I've often wondered as a journalist is how you capture that notion. It's a tough one, and I think it's tough for Americans to understand. America's not a very nostalgic place. And in some ways it's very subtle, and I think it's subtle in the region as well. I've tried to write about characters. The sculptor was one example, the bookseller was another. I've also tried to write about place, and I think place holds a certain significance in journalism, or in journalism that can be good about the region. There are places like I mentioned, Mutanabi Street, for instance, in Baghdad, Abu Nawas Street. There's places that I'm very fond of in Cairo still, in Cairo's downtown, the Gropi Cafe, for instance, or Rivoli, places that represent a bygone era in Egypt. And then I think what I discovered soon living in Lebanon was there was another place that you might maybe put in that category, and that's Hamra. I think only Hamra Street could have represented the most sophisticated, open, and pluralistic space in the Arab world. Again, people here may be familiar with it. From the 60s until the Civil War started in '75, Hamra's theaters and restaurants dominated nightlife in Beirut. AUB, the American University of Beirut, propelled its ferment and its cafes at hosting Arab dissidents, Palestinian exiles, Lebanese of all sects and tendencies. It shaped an intellectual sanctuary in a way that I think delivered a cadence to Arab politics. A friend of mine, a guy named Mohammed Suwaid, he was a film critic. We were once talking about it. He said, it was like the Arab Champs-Élysées. He said, if you wanted to make a career as an intellectual or get involved in film, the Hamra cafes were the best place to meet people and discuss. It was a meeting ground between the West and the Arab world. The Civil War, of course, in Lebanon ended its moment. In time, I think Hamra's intersection was subsumed in Beirut's collision, much like Baghdad today. It's shown a little bit of revival these days in Beirut. There are some new restaurants there. There are some new cafes. But I still feel it's a shadow of what it was. Hamra as an idea is gone, and so is what it represented. And I think it's very dangerous to try to conflate globalization with cosmopolitanism. And I have to say, I walk down this street often. I think I'm a victim a little bit of this same nostalgia. And each time I walk down it, I realize something that makes me very sad. I don't think there's any room left in Lebanon for what Hamra represented. I don't think there's any room left in Lebanon for it. Sadly, I'm not sure there's any room left in the Middle East for it today. There's an irony that for so many decades of criticism in the Arab world of Israel's exclusive view of its identity as a Jewish state, the Arab world today is organizing itself similarly, from Iraq to Lebanon and beyond. There really are no secular movements of import these days, the kind that once propelled it forward. Ideology has, in many ways, I think, died in the Middle East, be it Arab nationalism, currents of the left, and so on. And whatever their successes or failures, and there were plenty of them, it was hard to deny that in them, in those secular ideologies, just lost my train, sorry. In those secular ideologies, there was a universality that transcended the parochial identities of the past. That's simply no longer the case. I think politics are more and more reflected through this often unyielding religious discourse, or more primordial affiliations that break along religious sect and ethnicity. Loss of the notion of collective action, of uniting around principles or ideals. And then I think you're left with communities that are bereft of citizenship, sadly small. Each community comes away with its own existential notion of itself. Its very survival threatened by its own uniqueness. I think U.S. policy most spectacularly in Iraq was, but also in Lebanon, Palestine, and elsewhere, deserves a large degree of blame for what's been unleashed. I think even today there's a cynical ploy by U.S. policymakers to fan sectarian hatred for questionable short-term goals. But I think the Arab world's complicit too. And I think it's a sad record for a region that was so courageous for so long in resisting colonialism. As I mentioned, I spent the past year working on another book, and this one, of course, is far more personal. It's about Marjayoun, my family's ancestral village. It's also a book about identity. And I just noticed, I think, living in there, in Marjayoun the past years, that I see the same thing there that I see in Hamra, that I see on Mutanabi Street, that I see in Egypt, for instance, and other places. What I'm seeing is a place dying because it has no place left in the Arab world. And I have to say that makes me very sad. At the beginning of the talk, I'd said I wanted to talk about loss, and I think, indeed, that's what these places represent to me. Of all those, though, I think I feel most keenly the loss that comes from my friendship with this bookseller I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this man named Muhammad Hayawi. For brief moments in Baghdad, I think I saw life as it should have been in this shop, in a country that has lost so much. I saw life as it could have been and should have been